The first thing Caleb Mercer heard that morning was not the wind clawing at the shutters, nor the lonely groan of cattle shifting in the dark, but the thin, sharp cry of a baby cutting through the prairie silence like a knife through saddle leather. And for a long breath he lay there staring at the rafters of his small ranch house, wondering if grief had finally come to claim his senses, because no child had ever crossed his porch, and no woman had stepped over his threshold in 5 long years. Yet the cry came again, small but stubborn, rising above the restless whisper of the plains, as if the dawn itself had found a voice. Caleb swung his boots to the floor, joints stiff from yesterday's branding, and reached for the Colt resting on his bedside table out of habit more than fear, because a man living alone beyond the edge of town learned to greet every surprise with iron in his palm. He moved slow toward the door, each floorboard giving a low complaint under his weight, the cry growing clearer now, desperate and hungry. And when he pulled the door open, the early grey light spilled across his porch to reveal a wicker basket set square in the center like an offering, wrapped tight in a wool blanket the color of storm clouds, and inside that basket lay a red-faced baby squirming against the cold, fists waving at the sky, as if challenging the whole wide west to a fight. For a heartbeat, Caleb only stared, wind tugging at his shirt, mind empty as a dry well. He had seen calves born in blizzards and men die under open sun, but this sight shook him harder than either. The baby's cry wavered into a whimper, and those tiny fists slowed, and something inside his chest tightened in a way he did not recognize. He crouched down, slow as if approaching a wild mustang, slid the Colt back into his belt, and lifted the basket just enough to look closer. The blanket tucked neat around the child bore careful stitches along the hem, not the rough work of a ranch hand, but the steady hand of a woman who knew thread and patience. And Caleb's gaze drifted across the fence line toward the only neighboring house for half a mile, the small white place where the widow Eleanor Hayes had lived alone since the fever took her husband last winter. He carried the basket inside, boots thudding heavy on the boards, and set it on his kitchen table where maps and branding irons usually lay. The baby's cries softened to hiccuping breaths, dark eyes blinking up at him without fear, as if this broad-shouldered rancher with dust in his beard and scars on his knuckles was the most natural sight in the world. Caleb felt awkward standing there, hands hanging useless at his sides. He had no milk, no cradle, no notion what a baby required beyond warmth and gentleness, both things he had not offered freely since the day he buried his wife on a hill overlooking this very pasture. Yet here this small stranger lay breathing in his kitchen air as if claiming it for her own. The knock came just as Caleb was staring at the stove, trying to remember if babies could drink watered-down coffee, sharp and certain against his door. And when he opened it, Eleanor Hayes stood there wrapped in a brown shawl, her auburn hair pulled back neat despite the early hour, grey eyes calm as river stone. She did not look surprised to see him holding a squirming child awkward against his chest. Instead, her gaze dropped to the blanket, and something soft flickered across her face. "I reckon you found her," she said in a voice low and steady, and Caleb's brows drew tight, because there was no question in her tone, only quiet confirmation. "You know something about this?" he asked, not harsh but firm, and Eleanor stepped past him without waiting for permission, moving through his house like she had walked it 100 times in her thoughts. She reached out, practiced hands, and adjusted the blanket around the baby's chin, her fingers brushing the stitched hem. "I made this last spring," she said, "when I still believed I might need it." The words hung between them, heavy as thunder. Caleb understood then that the widow's grief had not been limited to a husband's grave. There had been hope once, and hope had withered. Yet here she stood now, eyes steady, hands sure, as if this child had given her sorrow a second shape. Caleb leaned against the wall, watching Eleanor move about his kitchen with quiet purpose. She found a small pot, poured water, warmed it careful over the flame, speaking soft to the baby all the while as if soothing a skittish colt. The child answered with little coos that seemed too trusting for a world so wide and rough. "Who left her?" he asked at last, and Eleanor shook her head slow. "I found her by my fence before sunrise," she said, "wrapped in this blanket. And I knew if I carried her into town, the sheriff would send her east to some orphan train without a second thought." She met his gaze square then. "You have land, Caleb Mercer. You have a name folks respect. And whether you admit it or not, you have a heart that still beats strong beneath all that dust." Outside the sun finally broke over the prairie, painting the fields gold as if blessing whatever strange fate had chosen this ranch for new life. Caleb stepped to the doorway with the baby, now quiet in his arms. Eleanor beside him, close enough that he felt the warmth of her shoulder through his shirt. The cattle lowed in the distance, unaware that their world had shifted. "This ain't my doing," he muttered, more to himself than her. And Eleanor gave a faint, sad smile. "Sometimes the Lord don't ask a man's permission," she replied. The baby stirred and wrapped her tiny fingers around Caleb's calloused thumb, holding tight as if she had made her choice. And out across the wide-open west, a new day stretched long and uncertain before them, promising trouble, change, and perhaps a second chance neither of them had dared to seek. By noon the news had traveled faster than a brush fire in August, because in small towns nothing stayed quiet for long, and Caleb Mercer found himself riding into town with the baby bundled against his chest. Eleanor Hayes seated side-saddle behind him, holding tight, not to the man but to the wicker basket, swinging from his saddle horn. The streets of Dry Creek fell near silent as they passed the general store and the hitching post outside the saloon. Men tipped their hats slow, women paused mid-sentence, and Sheriff Wallace stepped down from the boardwalk with a squint, sharp as barbed wire, saying he had heard tell of a child found at Mercer Ranch, and figured he'd best see it with his own eyes before gossip grew legs. Caleb dismounted careful, boots striking dust, and held the baby up just enough for the sheriff to see her blinking dark eyes. Wallace scratched at his jaw and muttered something about proper procedure, about notifying the county office in Abilene, about orphan placements and papers and signatures, and Caleb felt a slow burn rise in his chest at the thought of strangers deciding the child's fate like she was a stray calf. Eleanor stepped forward, calm and composed, explaining how she had found the baby at her fence wrapped in the blanket she herself had sewn months ago. Her voice carried neither shame nor fear, only a quiet certainty that made even the sheriff shift uneasy. Folks gathered closer. Mrs. Dalton from the bakery, whispering that the Lord worked in mysterious ways. Old Mr. Pryor claiming he had seen a rider near the North Ridge before dawn. And a pair of ranch hands speculating about troublemakers drifting west after the railroad laid fresh track beyond Fort Worth. Caleb listened without speaking, because talk was cheap and truths hard to come by on the prairie. The baby stirred against his chest and let out a small cry, and every head turned toward that fragile sound as if it were the church bell on Sunday morning. Sheriff Wallace cleared his throat and said he would give it a day or two before sending word east, provided someone took responsibility meanwhile, and his gaze lingered heavy on Caleb's broad shoulders. Responsibility was a word Caleb had carried before. He had worn it when he married, when he buried, when he rebuilt fences after storms flattened them flat, and he knew it came with sleepless nights and hard choices. He looked down at the baby whose fingers clutched the edge of his vest with stubborn strength, and he heard himself speak before doubt could choke the words. "She stays at my place till we know more," he said, firm as a hammer strike. Eleanor's breath caught quiet beside him, and the gathered townsfolk nodded slow, as if some unspoken decision had settled like dust after a stampede. That evening the prairie sky burned red, as if warning of storms to come, and Caleb sat at his kitchen table while Eleanor rocked the baby gentle in a makeshift cradle built from an old grain box padded with clean cloth. She had brought more supplies from her house, without asking permission. Flour sacks turned to swaddling wraps, a small tin of goat's milk, and a worn wooden rattle carved years ago by her late husband when hope had still lived under her roof. Caleb watched her move with steady grace, realizing the house no longer echoed empty but carried soft humming instead, a lullaby woven from memory and longing. "You ever think who her mother might be?" Caleb asked low, and Eleanor paused before answering. "I think about a woman riding through darkness with tears she cannot afford to shed," she said. "I think about fear, heavier than a saddle soaked in rain. And I think about love strong enough to leave a child where she might live, rather than keep her where she might not." Her eyes shone not with weakness, but with fierce understanding, and Caleb felt the truth of her words settle deep. Because the blanket's stitching had been careful, each seemed tight and even, not the hurried work of shame but the patient labor of someone who cared. Later that night, a rider appeared at the edge of Caleb's land, silhouette black against the moonlit grass, horse stamping restless near the old cottonwood by the creek. Caleb saw him from the porch, and felt instinct sharpened like a drawn blade. He handed the baby to Eleanor without a word, and stepped outside with rifle in hand. The wind carried no greeting from the stranger, only silence thick and waiting. Caleb called out once, voice steady as bedrock. but the rider turned and vanished into the dark before any answer came, leaving hoofprints pressed deep in the damp earth like a warning. When Caleb returned inside, Eleanor stood near the window, baby cradled safe against her chest, her face pale but resolute. "You reckon that was her kin?" she asked, and Caleb shook his head slow. "If kin wanted her back, they would have knocked on the door, not skulked in shadows," he replied, yet even as he spoke doubt coiled tight in his gut, because the West bred both courage and cowardice in equal measure, and whoever left that child had known exactly where to place her, between the lonely rancher who had lost everything and the widow who had nothing left to lose. And as the wind rattled the shutters, Caleb understood that finding the baby had been no accident at all. It had been a choice made by someone watching from the dark, and that choice was bound to bring consequences. Riding hard toward their quiet stretch of prairie, the rider came back at dawn 3 days later, not skulking in shadow this time, but sitting straight in the saddle beneath the old cottonwood by the creek, hat low and coat dusted pale from long miles. Caleb saw him from the porch while the baby slept against his shoulder, and Eleanor kneaded dough at the kitchen table. The prairie lay hushed under a sky the color of worn tin, and something in the rider's stillness told Caleb this was no passing drifter. He handed the child gently to Eleanor, feeling her fingers brush his with a steadiness that surprised him, then stepped down from the porch with rifle in hand, boots cutting a hard line through dew-soaked grass as he approached the waiting stranger. Up close, the rider proved younger than Caleb expected, maybe 25, jaw tight with sleepless nights, eyes rimmed red, not from drink but from grief held too long. He dismounted, slow, and removed his hat, revealing hair flattened by wind and worry. "I ain't here to cause harm," he said, voice rough as unpolished wood. "I came to see if she's alive." Caleb studied him without lowering the rifle, asked who she was to him, and the young man swallowed before answering. "She's my sister's child," he said, "and my sister's gone. Fever took her 2 weeks past outside Wichita. She begged me not to let the baby end up in some city ward. Said find good folk, folk with land and backbone, folk who'd give the girl a fighting chance." Caleb felt the wind shift between them, carrying the scent of creek water and wild sage, and he asked why leave her silent on a porch like unwanted freight. The young man's shoulders sagged at that. "Because I ain't fit to raise a child," he admitted. "I ride with cattle crews drifting north toward Dodge City. I sleep under open sky more nights than not. I carry no house, no steady coin, and men like me lose more than they keep." His voice cracked once, then steadied. "I watched this ranch for 2 days before setting her down. Saw how you worked your stock. Saw the widow tend her garden alone yet proud. I figured if any place could hold her safe, it'd be here." Caleb lowered the rifle then, not because he trusted easy, but because truth rang clear in the young man's tone. He led him toward the house without another word. Eleanor met them at the door, baby awake in her arms, wrapped in that same gray blanket stitched with patient care. The young rider stepped forward, trembling despite himself. When the child's tiny hand brushed his knuckle, he shut his eyes tight, as if struck by lightning. "She's called Rose," he whispered. "My sister named her before she passed." And Eleanor's lips curved soft at the name, repeating it low like a blessing. "Rose," as if the sound alone might anchor the child to this soil forever. Inside the kitchen, the 3 adults stood in uneasy circle while sunlight spilled across worn floorboards. The young rider explained his sister had married a rail worker who died when a bridge beam fell near Kansas City. She had drifted west seeking fresh air for weak lungs, only to meet fever on the plains. With no kin willing to claim the child, and no funds to settle, he had done the only thing he believed might save her. Caleb listened, arms crossed heavy over his chest, glancing at Eleanor, whose expression held neither anger nor pity, only fierce protectiveness, as if the child were already stitched into her heart, the way thread bound that blanket's edge. "You aiming to take her back now?" Caleb asked, plain and steady. The young man stared at the floorboards a long moment before shaking his head slow. "I came to see if she was cared for," he answered. "If she was hungry or cold, I'd have carried her off no matter the odds." But seeing this, he gestured to Eleanor rocking Rose gentle near the stove. "Seeing warmth and walls, and to folks who look at her like sunrise instead of burden, I reckon she's found what my sister prayed for." His voice carried no resentment, only surrender to a truth bigger than pride. Eleanor stepped closer then, meeting the rider's gaze square. "You can visit come planting season or harvest if you wish," she said. "Blood ought not be cut clean unless it must be. But no, this child will be raised strong. She will read and write and ride. She will know her mother's courage and your sacrifice. Caleb felt something settle firm inside him at those words. Not fear nor hesitation, but decision rooted deep as oak. He moved beside Eleanor and placed his hand over Rose's tiny back, saying quiet yet unshakable, "She'll carry my name if the law allows, and she never doubts she was wanted here." The young rider nodded once, tears unshed shining bright in morning light. Then he stepped outside and mounted his horse, riding north with shoulders lighter than when he arrived. Caleb watched until the figure blurred against the horizon, then turned back toward the house where Eleanor stood in the doorway holding Rose against her heart. The prairie wind moved through tall grass like a hymn rising from the earth itself, and Caleb understood that fate had not merely left a baby on his porch, but had carved a new road straight through his guarded soul. He stepped inside, closed the door against the wide, uncertain west, and in that small ranch house between dusk and dawn, a family took root where loneliness once ruled, held together by a blanket stitched in hope and a choice, made not from duty alone but from love strong enough to weather every storm the frontier might send their way.